Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav, and we'll be learning today Mirat Hashem Daf Kuf Yud Ches Amud Aleph. We're continuing to learn the halachas of Daled Minim, and we have been learning the halachas that apply to the Esrog. We pick up today on the bottom of Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Beis in Siman Taf Reish Mem Ches Sif Yud Beis. So, as we've seen already previously, the top of the Esrog, the area of the Esrog that we call the Chaitim, which is from the point at which the Esrog starts to taper and upwards, right? So we've said from when the Esrog, not when it begins to actually taper and slope inward, but for it really starts to slope inward and form a point. The upper part of the Esrog is what is called the Chaitim. And when it comes to things that pasul an Esrog because of the Esrog's appearance, we treat the chaitim of the Esrog, the top of the Esrog, more chamer than the rest of the Esrog. So on that note, the Mechaber says in Sif Yud Beis, Mechot mai ve'elech, from the chaitim of the Esrog and upwards, Tahainu mimakim shemaschil l'shapeya ad hapitma, that's from the point at which the Esrog starts to slope inward to a point, and until the pitum, pasul chazazis, a chazazis, which a chazazis is a condition we've been discussing, and we're going to discuss it even more today. This is some kind of a condition that grows on the esrog that results in either blisters or boils or some type of scabs. So if a chazazis will appear on the chaitim, v'chol shinui mare, or any other kind of change to the appearance of the esrog, b'chol shehu. So the halacha that the Mechaber is telling me over here is, you should know that the chaitim of the esrog is more chamer than the rest of the esrog, and therefore any kind of pasul that pasuls an esrog because it's an appearance which is not hodor. So if you have a chazazis, you have these scabs or blisters on the chaitim of the esrog, that makes the esrog not hodor. It doesn't look pretty, it doesn't look nice, it doesn't look beautiful. If you have other kinds of marks, that would pasul the esrog. So all of these types of psulim, if they're on the chaitim of the esrog, they pasul the esrog, even with a kol shehu, even in a tiny amount. Says the Mishnah Berurah cut memhei, v'chol shinoi mare, anything that makes a change in the appearance of the esrog. Kigain, for example, says the Chavetz Chaim, shachar if a lavan, if you have black spots or white spots, kamavur lekamon b'sif tezayin, which we're going to discuss shortly in sif tezayin, that these are changes in appearance to the esrog. These are blemishes on the esrog that could pasul the esrog. So on the chaitim of the esrog, they would pasul the esrog even with a kol shehu. However, and this is a very important Mishnah Berurah, says the Mishnah Berurah, where we give forth this concept that a change in appearance on the esrog could pasul the esrog b'chol shehu, the dafka kishenira lakoil. That's only true when it's something which is nira lakoil. It's something that everybody could see. Why does a pasul in hadar pasul the esrog on the chaitim of the esrog? Because the chaitim of the esrog is the makom hiduroi. That's the most beautiful spot on the esrog. And like we said, the Mishnah Berurah said this earlier, that when people look at the esrog, that's the area that they see right away. That's the most visible part of the esrog. If you go back to Kuf Yud Zayin Amud Beis in the Mishnah Berurah Oiskat Labetes, the Mishnah Berurah said, Shenire Sham Le'enayim Yoiser Mishar Mekayme Shabai. It's more obvious, it's more visible over there than anywhere else on the esrog. Sheba Oisei Shipua, because on that sloped area of the esrog near the top, Adam Noisein Einov. That's where a person looks. So when it comes to these types of psulim, where the esrog is pasul because of a change in appearance, some kind of a mark on the esrog, the chaitim of the esrog is the most chamor area. However, again, let's take a look at this Mishnah Berurah here. It's cut memvav. The dafka kishenir lakoil. It has to be something that's visible to all. Aval, however, Im ein nira la'ayin, if it's not really so visible to the eye, machmas dakusai, because it's something that's tiny, v'tzarech lehistakel, and in order to see it, you really have to look. Ein zeh kol shehu shapaisel. That's not what the Mechaber means when the Mechaber says a mark on the chaitim of the Esrog will pasul the Esrog in a kol shehu. It doesn't mean that you need a magnifying glass and you're searching over the top of the Esrog with a magnifying glass. That's not what it means. The kol shehu over here means it could be small, but it has to be nireh le'inayim, or the way the Mishnah Berurah said even more, nireh la'koil. It has to be something that everybody could see. You take the Esrog, yeah, I see that. Yeah, that black mark over there, yeah, I see that. That's nireh la'koil. But if it's something that you're doing this, is there a mark over there? Is it a clean Esrog? I'm not sure. That's not the kol shehu that the Mechaber is talking about over here, and he says that would not pasul the Esrog. Now we'll discuss that a little bit more near the end of the shir. Okay. Continues the Mechaber on the top line of Kuf Yud Ches Amud Aleph. Before we even read this inside, we should remember that in the very beginning of Siman Taf Reish Mem Ches, in Sif Aleph, on Kuf Tes Vav Amud Beis, we mentioned the pasul of Yavesh, a dried out Esrog. Now, it struck me as very interesting over there. The Mechaber said over there, Esrog HaYavesh pasul. A dried out Esrog is pasul. Okay, what constitutes a dried out Esrog? So, the Mechaber gave me over there, V'shir HaYaveshus, how do you measure dryness? What's the shear? What's the measurement for a dried out Esrog? And the Mechaber said, Kishe'ene moitzi shum lecha, if it doesn't give out any moisture. And we had a very interesting Mechaber and a very interesting Mishnah Berurah that told us how to go ahead and check the Esrog using a needle and a thread, and pulling a thread through the Esrog, seeing if there's any moisture on the thread. But there's one thing that the Mechaber, neither the Mechaber nor the Mishnah Berurah, really told us at the beginning of Siman Taf Reish Mem Ches, and that is, when you talk about a dried out Esrog, how much of the Esrog has to be dried out? Does the entire Esrog have to be dried out in order to have this pasul of Yavesh? What if only parts of the Esrog seem to be dried out? Is there a pasul of Yavesh? And that we did not really see. However, the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Cotton Aleph, again on Kuf Tes Vav Amud Beis in Sif Aleph, the Mechaber did say, the Mishnah Berurah did say, V'emu Yavesh rak b'miktsasai, if only part of the Esrog is dried out, ayin lekamon b'Sif Yud Beis, look later on in Sif Yud Beis, over Mishnah Berurah Sham, and in the Mishnah Berurah over there. And that's what we're coming to over here now. Says the Mechaber, the top line of Kuf Yud Ches Amud Aleph, V'yesh mi she'omer. There are those that say, and the Baragola brings this down, he says it's from the Torah, in the name of the Ravid. V'yesh mi she'omer, to hu hadin, that the same halacha that we just saw in the beginning of Sif Yud Beis, that the chaitim of the Esrog is treated more stringently than the rest of the Esrog when it comes to a pasul that's based on appearance. The yesh mi she'omer, there are those that say to hu adin, the same halacha applies. The yavesh pasul sham b'chol shehu, that a dried out area, a dried out spot on the chaitim of the Esrog will pasul the Esrog the same way these other types of psulim pasul the Esrog on the chaitim b'kol shehu. Yavesh will also pasul the Esrog on the chaitim of the Esrog b'kol shehu. Now, the reason for this would be, and this is beferish, I found it in the Bir Agra. The Bir Agra says the pasul of Yavesh is also a pasul of Hadar. A dried out Esrog is not Hadar. What happens when an Esrog dries out? It turns brown, right? It shrivels, it turns brown. That is an appearance-based pasul. It doesn't look beautiful. It doesn't look Hadar. So therefore, says the Bir Agra, the Ravid holds that the same way any other kind of blemish that mars the appearance of the Esrog will pasul on the chaytim b'kolshu, yavesh will also pasul the esrog b'kolshu. Seems to make a lot of sense. Let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah's Kat Mem Zayin. V'yesh mi she'omer duhu adin de yavesh. And the Mishnah Berurah says, V'chein pasak ha'eli rabba ushar achroinim, v'lav davka yavesh. And this doesn't only apply to the pasul of yavesh, hu hadin shar psulin de misham hadar. Anything that pasels the esrog because it mars the appearance of the esrog and it causes the esrog not to be hadar, if it appears on the chaytim of the esrog, it will pasul the esrog bekolshu. Ois katan memches sham bekolshu. Over there on the chaytim of the esrog, yavesh will pasul the esrog bekolshu. You even have a tiny dried out spot on the top of the esrog. Of course, again, it has to be like the Mishnah Berurah said in Ois Katan Mem Vav. It can't be tiny, 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 tiny. It has to be something that's near a lakol. It has to be something that everybody could see. It has to be very visible. So, but a spot of yavesh, sham, at the top of the esrog on the chaytim, pasuls b'kolshu. Says the Mishnah Berurah's Katan Mem Ches, hainu b'mkayim chatmai. We're talking about, again, on the chaytim. That's what the Mechaber meant when he said, V'yesh bi she'omer dehu adin de yavesh pasul sham. Over there, on the chaytim, yavesh pasuls b'kolshu. But how about the rest of the esrog? So, says the Mishnah Berurah, as far as the rest of the esrog, avol b'shar mekaymoisa esrog, but as far as the rest of the esrog, not on the chaytim, what's the halacha of yavesh when it comes to the rest of the esrog? Dinoi kachazozis vishinoi mare. The halacha of yavesh is identical to the halacha of chazozis and the halacha of any other shinoi mare. These are all psulim that pasul the esrog because they affect the appearance of the esrog. What's the halacha? Shebemakom echad dinoi berubai. If there's one unified dried out area of the esrog, so it depends. Is it covering the majority of the area of the esrog? So again, if there's a tiny dried out spot on the chaytim, on the upper part of the esrog, that will pasul the esrog bekolshu. Let's say there is no dried out spot on the chaytim. The chaytim looks beautiful. It's only from the chaytim and down that the esrog is yavesh. So then it depends. What are we talking about? Is it one contiguous area of yaveshus where the esrog is dried out? Then it depends. We have to measure it. We saw the Chazon Ish. We take a thread. We would encircle that dried out area. And now let's see. Is it roiv of the esrog? Is it the majority of the esrog? If it's the majority of the esrog, so then the esrog is going to be pasul because it's yavesh berubai. How about if it's not one contiguous area? How about on the lower part of the esrog, there's one dried out area here, there's another dried out spot over there, there's another dried out spot over there. So then Mishnah Berurah says again, we apply the same halacha that we applied by chazazis. If there are 2 or 3 dried spots, pasul af b'miyuta, then it will pasul the esrog, even if it's only a miyut of the esrog, because now the esrog looks kim and nummer. Now it looks like a spotted esrog. If it's a spotted esrog, it's not hadar, and the esrog is going to be pasul. Now, this Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Mem Ches, is written on the Yesh Mi She'omer over here in Sif Yud Beis. So again, I want to point out that in Taf Reish Mem Ches Sif Aleph, where the Mechaber first introduced the pasul of yavesh, he did not give us a shear. The Mechaber did not tell us how much of the esrog has to be yavesh. He only told us how to measure if it is yavesh. You draw a thread through it, and you see if there's any leichus on the thread. Over here in Sif Yud Beis, the Mechaber is telling us a yesh mi she'omer. He's bringing us a ravid that says the way yavesh works is if there's even a kolshu of yavesh on the chaytim, the esrog is pasul. As far as the rest of the esrog, it depends. If it's yavesh in a bunch of spots, so then it's kim and nummer. then it's going to pasul the esrog because it's not hadar, because it's like a spotted esrog. If it's in one contiguous area, then it has to be roiv. If it's roiv, it'll pasul the esrog. If not, not. But that's all written on the yesh bisha omer. Okay, what's the other opinion? What's the other opinion to this yesh bisha omer? If there's a yesh bisha omer, that means that's a dissenting opinion. What's the other opinion? Not brought down over here. So the truth is, if you take a look at the Bir HaGra, the Bir HaGra Taka brings down another shita, and the Bir HaGra says that the other shita holds that yavesh is not something that would pasul an esrog beroif. It would pasul the esrog because the majority of the esrog is yavesh. In order for yavesh to pasul an esrog, it has to be entirely yavesh. The esrog has to be completely yavesh. And that's why the Mechaber did not give us a shear in Sif Aleph. Excuse me. In Sif Aleph, the Mechaber told me, Esrog hayavesh, what are the exact words? Esrog hayavesh, pasul. A dried out esrog is pasul. What does that mean? That means the whole esrog is dried out. Esrog hayavesh, a dried out esrog. A dried out esrog is an esrog that has completely turned brown, is shriveled up, it looks like it's dried out. Then the Mechaber says, okay, how do you tell if it's dried out? Take a needle and thread, pull it through the esrog. Guess what? Even if the esrog is brown and looks dried out, if you take a needle and thread and you pull it through the esrog in the proper way, and you see lechus, you see moisture on the thread, guess what? The esrog is not pasul. Why? Because it's not yavesh. It's brown. Okay, but that's not yavesh. That's an esrog, has different maturity phases that it goes through. At one point, it's green. Okay, that's a normal condition of the esrog. When it's unripe, it's green. As it ripens, it turns yellow. As it starts to dry out, it turns brown. That's a normal mareh esrog. If the entire esrog is dried out, then the Mishnah on Lamed Daled Lamed Beis says esrog hayavesh is pasul. So what constitutes an esrog hayavesh? An esrog that completely dried out. But now the Mechaber had to tell you, how do you know if it's dried out? Only if you drag a thread through it. Then you'll see if it's taka dried out. It's not so much really a pasul, I guess, in appearance. I guess it's already just a ruined esrog. It's an esrog hayavesh. A dried out esrog is a pasul. So that shita holds that the only time an esrog is pasul is if it's completely dried out. That shita also holds that a dried out spot on the chaitim of the esrog is not going to pasul the esrog. Why? Because when does something pasul on the chaitim more stringently than the rest of the esrog? A type of pasul that normally pasuls an esrog only on roiv, only on the majority of the esrog, like a chazazis. Chazazis, we have seen, could pasul an esrog in three different ways. If the chazazis is on a contiguous area, it only pasuls the esrog if it encompasses roiv of the esrog. Therefore, if there's a tiny chazazis on the chaitim, it will pasul the esrog. Since chazazis is a pasul that pasuls an esrog only if it covers the majority, there's a stringency that if it is a tiny bit on the chaitim, it pasuls the esrog. Chazazis could also pasul an esrog b'shtayim or shloisha b'kaimes because it's kimenumar. But that's not the same type. Yavesh is not the same type of pasul. Yavesh does not pasul an esrog if it's yavesh over roiv, according to the Deir Rishayna. It only pasuls an esrog if the entire esrog is yavesh. So then, if there's a tiny spot on the chaitim that's yavesh, that's not going to pasul the esrog. That's the Deir Rishayna, which really is Sif Aleph in Tov Reish Mem Ches. Over here, the Yesh Bisha Omer in Sif Yud Beis is a different shita. This is the shita Sarayvid. The shita Sarayvid is that yavesh is just like chazazis. It's a pasul that pasuls an esrog if it covers roiv. Since it's a pasul that pasuls the esrog if it covers roiv, even if there's a kol shehu on the chaitim, since the chaitim is more chamer, it'll pasul the esrog with a kol shehu on the chaitim. Okay. Now we go to Sif Yud Gimel, where we continue to discuss the halacha of a chazazis, this type of growth or scab on an esrog. Says the Mechaber, chazazis hu kimin avabuos. The chazazis condition is like boils, blisters, scabs, some kind of a growth. V'yesh by mamish, and you could feel it. Shemikaymai nicker, its place is recognizable b'mishush, by feel. Shehu gavaya mea esrog. It is a raised spot on the esrog. So if you close your eyes and you feel along the esrog, you'll be able to feel the chazazis. You'll feel a blita. You'll feel something that's sticking out, that's raised above the rest of the esrog. Now the entire esrog is bumpy. We have chiritzim and blitas all over the esrog. But a chazazis is something that's even more raised. It's significant. You could feel it with your fingers. Says the Mishnah Berurah Oiskat Memtes Avabuos. Very interesting Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah Yesh Oimreim. There are those that say, and this is brought down the Knesset Hagdolah, Dafka Shtei Avabuos. In order to have this pasul of avabuos, you need to have a minimum of 2 of them. What do I mean? Whenever we reference a chazazis, so let's say when we said in Siftes we said that if there's a chazazis, even a kolshehu, on the chaytim of the esrog is pasul. Guess what? You need 2. Because what constitutes a chazazis? 2 avabuos. 1 avabua, 1 blister, 1 boil, does not constitute a chazazis. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says here. Yesh Oimrim, this Yesh Oimrim says, Dafka Shtei Avabuos. In order to have the condition of chazazis, you need a minimum of 2 avabuos. Devalavachi, because without 2, Eino Bechlal chazazis. Without 2, that does not constitute a chazazis. So according to this opinion, if you would have 1 avabua on the chaytim of the esrog would be kosher. You know why? Because that's not called a chazazis on the chaytim of the esrog. A chazazis on the chaytim of the esrog means 2 avabuas on the chaytim of the esrog. So too, when we said that if you have chazazis b'shnayim or b'shloishim mekaymis, when we said that if you have chazazis on 2 or 3 spots on the esrog, it could pasul the esrog. It doesn't mean 1 avabua here, 1 avabua here, 1 avabua here. No, it means 2 avabuas here, 2 avabuas here, 2 avabuas here. That's what it means. Chazazis b'shtayim u'shloisha mekaymis, according to this shita, according to this Yesh Oimrim in the beginning of Mishnah Berurah is cut memtes. Now this is brought down from a Knesset Hagdolah. I think the Knesset Hagdolah is basing himself on Rashi to the Mishnah on Lamed Daled Lamed Beis. Rashi to the Mishnah Lamed Daled Lamed Beis. The Mishnah says chazazis. Rashi says avabuos dakos, and avabuos is lashon rabim. So it would seem that the condition of chazazis consists of more than 1 avabua. Less than 2 avabuos is not the condition of chazazis. However, the Mishnah Berurah continues and he says, Aval Rabim me'achrayim cholkin al zeh. Many achrayim argue on this. The daitam, in their opinion, is the afav abua akas, even 1 blister or boil, kol shenira l'chol adam la'ayin, as long as it's visible to all people, to the eye. Someone looks at the esrog, they can see it right away. Below yistaklos, without searching, mikri chazazis, that is called a chazazis. Now this brings up a very interesting question. Kosvo ha-paiskim. The paiskim write, the dafka kishenoilid ha-chazazis me'atzmus ha-esrog. When is this chazazis problematic? Says the Mishnah Berurah, the paiskim tell us, and this is brought down from the Mabit, the paiskim tell us that a chazazis is a problem when it is, I guess the words I would use is when it comes forth when it is produced by the esrog itself. It is a condition that is inherent to the esrog. The esrog produced this scab or this boil from itself. However, if you look at the surface of the esrog and you see an uneven area, that's akaim. Akaim is like twisted, bent. You see an uneven area on the esrog, va'adaim, and it's reddish. Adaim could also be used for brown. So you have a reddish brown, like deformed spot on the esrog. Machmas she'oiktzim oisa koitzim, that is a result of thorny protrusions on the esrog tree having scratched or somehow abraded the surface of the esrog, kosher. That is kosher. So what the Mabit is telling me over here is like this. We're talking about this condition of chazazis that pasuls the esrog. The condition of chazazis, says the Mabit, is like a disease. It's an affliction. It might be a rot. It might be a fungus. It's something, a condition that came from the esrog itself that caused a growth, a blister, a boil. That pasuls the esrog. But over here, when you have a mark on the esrog, that's a result of something from the tree laying on the esrog and maybe abrading the esrog a little bit. So now there's this like brownish, reddish, slightly deformed area. Says the Mabit, that's not a chazazis. That's something that was external to the esrog. It has an external cause. It was caused by this kites, by this thorn. And he says that's kosher. V'ayid b'shari tshuva u'b'bi'ar halacha. And he sends us with this to the shari tshuva and the bi'ar halacha. Now, the shari tshuva over here and the bi'ar halacha and the ber hetiv as well all discuss the same thing. And that is, they bring down this Mabit. And they say, okay, the Mabit says, when do we have this problem of a chazazis? Only when the problem is inherent to the esrog, not when it has an external cause. The Shari Tshuva brings down something from the Aguda. The Aguda writes, he says that if you have an esrog where a kites was laying on the esrog, that will cause a chazazis. And then the esrog will be pasul because of the chazazis. So the Aguda seems to be saying in direct opposition to the Mabit. The Mabit says that when is a chazazis a problem? When it's internal to the esrog, when it's a condition that comes forth from the esrog itself. But if it comes from a kites, it's okay. Says the Aguda not that way. The Aguda says, Mokim sheshoichev al kaitzim, if the esrog is laying on a kites, gadal boy chazazis, that will cause a chazazis. And that's a problematic chazazis, says the Aguda. So the Shari Tshuva, the Bi'ar Halacha, the Bikurei Yaakov, they struggle to reconcile the Mabit and the Aguda. And there are different answers given. The answer that the Mishnah Berurah gives is the Mishnah Berurah says that it could be the Bi'ar Halacha. He says it could be that the Aguda and the Mabit are really talking about two different types of conditions, two different types of chazazises, if you will. The Mabit is saying there is something called a chazazis. A chazazis is a condition that is internal to the esrog that will give forth to a blister, a boil, or a scab. That's a pasul. Then the Mabit says there's another mitzius. There's a mitzius that if the surface of the esrog becomes damaged by a kites, it will make a mark on the esrog. It'll make a reddish-brownish mark on the esrog. And that is something that's not internal to the esrog. It has an external cause. And the Ramah is going to say that those types of marks also are derech gediloi. That's the way an esrog grows. An esrog is a natural product. Sometimes you buy a leather briefcase and it says on it, leather is a natural product. It's a hide of an animal. Sometimes the animal will scratch against the wall, right? The Gemara in Baba Kama, it's a told of the Mazik of Shane. An animal will scratch itself. So there are natural blemishes and natural imperfections to the hide of an animal. Guess what? There are natural imperfections to the exterior of an esrog. An esrog doesn't grow in a glass jar. An esrog grows on a tree. On a tree there are kaitzim, and there are branches, and there are twigs, and there are leaves, and you're going to get bletlach, and you're going to get marks. So a chazazis that's caused by a condition in the esrog, and it makes an ugly scab, it makes an ugly blister, an ugly boil, that's a pasul. But something that formed from a kaitz, the Mabit says, that's not a pasul. That's not the pasul of chazazis. The Aguda, says the Bir Halacha, is talking about something else. The Aguda is talking about where something was laying on the esrog, and because it was laying on the esrog, that spot of the esrog was not exposed to the air. It didn't get any air circulating around it. Now we know when you have a fruit and you cover up part of the fruit and you don't let it get exposed to the air, sometimes it will begin to rot. Says the Bir Halacha, that's what the Aguda is talking about. The Aguda is not talking about an abrasion from a kaitz, or he's not talking about a blettel from a leaf. What the Aguda is talking about is there was something laying on the outside of the esrog that blocked the esrog from being exposed to the air, that caused that spot on the esrog to rot. Once it caused that spot on the esrog to rot, that caused a condition and caused a chazazis. That's the chazazis that pasuls. That is internal to the esrog. The condition might be a result of something laying on it. That's why it rotted inside, and that's why it gave forth to these avabuas. But that's how the Bir Halacha wants to reconcile the Mabit and the Aguda. Okay, now this also brings up the question of these bletlach on the esrogim, these bletels, these marks that come from a leaf laying on the esrog. Are those problematic or not? So let's go weiter first before we speak about that. Let's see the Ramah. Says the Ramah, end of the second line down in the Shulchan Aruch. Haga, v'lochein, yesh lahakshir oisan chazazis, based on the above. Now, the Ramah is coming off of the Mechaber. The Mechaber defined chazazis, and he said that a chazazis is a raised avabua. It has yesh by mamish. It's something that you could feel. Says the Ramah, v'lachein, therefore, yesh lahakshir oisan chazazis, we could be makshir an esrog that has this thing that the Ramah is calling a chazazis. It's a blemish of some kind. Shekayrin Bilshain Ashkenaz mul. That in Ashkenaz they call a mul. Lefisha Einon Givayim Mishar HaEsrog. The reason we could say that the esrog is kosher is because that blemished area is not raised. In order to have a chazazis that's pasul, the Mechaber says it has to be raised. It has to be something you could feel. This is not something that's raised. The yesh bisha kasav, and there are those that write, says the Ramah, the yesh lach shiram, that you could kasher these blemishes, these mul blemishes, mitam de nechshavim mare esrog, because that's considered the appearance of an esrog. That's natural to an esrog. That's the type of marks that esrogim have. Me'acher dirigilim lihiyos harbekach. Again, this is not a disease. The chazazis blisters are a disease. They're a mum. But the bletlach, these mul bletlach, are not an aberration in the esrog. It's the natural appearance of the esrog. Says the Mishnah Berurah is katanun, the nechshavim mari esrog. Olafi tamzeh, and for this reason, says the Mishnah Berurah, afilu givayim mishar esrig. Even if this mole is a little bit raised over the rest of the esrig, kosher, it's still kosher. And when it comes to this type of chazazis, it doesn't matter. It's kosher even if it's on the chaitim. Because again, this is something that's natural to the esrig. However, the Mishnah Berurah says, you shouldn't be makel with these kind of marks if they're raised over the rest of the esrig, only if there's a shasat chak. Okay, we're left a little bit, I think, vague when it comes to these types of blemishes, the mul, or what we call a blettel, what the halacha of these types of marks are. So the Dirshu has a footnote, number 90. It's in the back on page 82. So first, the first paragraph here of Dirshu footnote 90. Mevor b'dvaro shebe'enam gevayim yesh lahachsher afib nishtana mara ha'esrog. It would come out from the Mishnah Berurah here. The Mishnah Berurah said that we shouldn't be makel on these kind of marks if they're gevayim, if they're raised. But if they're not raised, we could be makel, even though it causes you could see it. It changes the appearance of the esrog. And here we have a very critical prima gadim, which I think gives a rise to the way we treat our esrogim. Achein kasav a prima gadim. The prima gadim writes, "Va'ani loy kibalti bazeh." This is not what I was makabel. Va'ashrei mi, fortunate is the one sheyuchal likach esrog na, who could purchase a beautiful esrog hadar that is extra beautiful, the naki mikael, and 100% clean. V'chein kasav achai adam sha'ayare l'dvar Hashem yishtada liknais esrog v'loy chazazis u'maheres, should attempt to purchase an esrog that is completely free from any kind of chazazis or any other kind of blemish to the esrog. Now, then he continues in the next paragraph to talk about these blettels. And he says, even if they're a little bit raised above the rest of the esrog, the Stipler Goyen wrote that they're kosher, because even though it's true that if you close your eyes and you feel the surface of the esrog, you could feel the blettel, because that area is like a little abraded, it has a funny texture to it, you could feel the blettel. He says, but that's not what the Mechaber means. The Mechaber says, Mekayma nikor b'mishush shehu gavoya mea esrog. The Mechaber didn't say that you could feel the blemish. He said you could feel that it's raised. The blettel that we have on our esrogim, you could feel it because it's like rough. There's like a rough, area where the leaf was laying on the esrog. But you're not feeling it because it's a raised bump. That's what the Mechaber means when he talks about a chazazis. You feel that there's a raised bump on the esrog. This is not a bump. It's a rough surface, but it's not a bump. So these blettels, it turns out, are not a pasul of chazazis. They would not pasul the esrog. Okay, so we're going to stop over here. We'll continue tomorrow, Mitzvah Hashem, with Sifyud Daled on the top of Yud Ches on the base. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The discussion of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe should say Yeshua's refuahs and panasat sheduchim to all those in need. We should be zeichet to see the Bias Gal Tzedek. B'meherav Yameinu Amen. Be well.